Defensively, I thought they did a much better job on Wemby in the second game.
Was huge because of Peyton Watson.
He played the last 22 minutes straight. Malone was just like, we need you on Wemby. Like, just no one else can do this. But I think just like his presence on the floor makes a really big difference in the Nuggets defensively. He's basically involved in all of my favorite defensive games of the season. Jamal hit a transition pull-up three. I love how he's not hesitating on that now. I do, like, it's one of those like no, yes shots. I just want Jamal generally to take more threes. And if the only way that we get him to do that is by taking the transition pull-up jumpers, then I guess that's what I have to live with.
It's really easy for a defender to kind of be in a soft-ish drop and contain Jokić and him. Just shoot it off the handoff or a screen, even if you're like kind of off balance, rather than driving into Lively and getting nothing out of it and getting blocked or whatever at the rim. Welcome back to What's in a Game. I'm Will Jones, back from being sick with Grace Jean. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thankfully, I'm not sick either. Yeah, there's a nasty flu going around. It's not just in the NBA. It's all over the country. And maybe some of our viewers and listeners are cooped up at home listening to us. And for that, I say sorry.
Yeah, I hope anyone who's listening is not sick. But Jokić was sick. Maybe some of the other Nuggets are sick. I guess we can speculate about that when we break down some of these weird games where we've been down and have to come back, which is typical of this season.
Is that weird? Yeah, I was going to say that sounds pretty typical. Typical Nuggets. I was looking at a tweet yesterday. It was from Automatic NBA that listed the most, was it 20 plus point comebacks like in the second half, like over the last 5 seasons or something. And the Nuggets led the field by a lot. It was like 25 of those games. So that was cool. I mean, it's like, well, is that a good thing? Well, second place was OKC. So obviously not the OKC of today. They're often just leading the entire time. Although I will say they have had a bunch of games in a row until like they just played the Knicks and completely blew them out. But ever since the NBA Cup final, actually, their version of going on a slump is going down double digits at half every game and then winning anyway. So the first game that happened after our last show was the Hawks game on a back-to-back. And the Nuggets are a total wagon on back-to-backs. This was a blowout win, like basically like wire to wire. The defense showed up. This was another Hawks game, I will say, without Jalen Johnson. And I was a little nervous about that before I heard that he was out because he missed the first matchup. And that was we faced the Hawks on back-to-backs twice, which was interesting. Trae Young did play, but Jalen Johnson was out. And I thought that was important because their offense just like doesn't work. I feel like Dyson Daniels has been struggling more offensively generally. And he's a defensive beast, but he just like wasn't involved in like most of the actions that we had. So I just felt like we just got whatever we wanted, which is evident by the final score of 139 to 120. We were playing defense until we stopped because we were up so big and then whatever. So I was just like, whatever, like this game was.
Yeah, the Spurs game was a back-to-back. And obviously we didn't win the first and we won the second. And we're not going to go back into the Suns. But the Suns, while it wasn't a back-to-back, we played them in back-to-back
right. They've been
doing.
We talked about the increased frequency of these baseball series in the schedule, which usually means you're in the same place, I think. And I don't know because I don't watch baseball. But the Spurs games were actually like we had one in Denver and then the next day it was in San Antonio. But you got to play the same team twice in a row. And like you said, yeah, just like with the Suns.
And even with a game in between, like with the Suns, I would think the home and away dynamic would matter more because, it's quick turnarounds in these situations. And, your role players play better at home. And but here on the Spurs, we lost at home and won away. So I guess you never know. What do you want to say about these Spurs games?
I definitely thought that. So you went on Serbian Quarter, I think, after both Spurs games.
Yeah.
And you made a really good point that I think cut the team a little bit more slack than I would have initially. But I agreed with you. You said that there's a real difficulty in a team that's like the Denver Nuggets that is still trying to find their own identity, trying to figure out how to go at a player like Wemby because he's so game breaking defensively. You're not at the same time you're trying to like figure out which sets work and get everybody into like a good like ball is moving, like rhythm and chemistry working out each other. He's just a player that's on the court to like break that.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought in that first Spurs game, the fact that Jokić in particular struggled in the Wemby matchup. Now, I say that he struggled in the Wemby matchup not because he didn't score on Wemby like one on one,
Mm-hmm.
but because Jokić is the engine and the hub of the whole offense, the way that Wemby guards him, it's not just about Jokić being able to score. It's about being able to get everybody involved, creating passing windows and all of that. And Wemby, with his 8-foot wingspan, was making everything difficult. Now, in that first game, Jokić did finish with 41 points, but he was really inefficient, 51% true shooting. He bombed from 3, like, a lot. Like, I think he took, like, 10 threes in that game. And it was more, I felt it wasn't so some people say that Jokić does this to, like, pull the big out of the paint and try to, like, create more open opportunities for other people, but I felt like he was more using it as a crutch because he didn't wanna go inside. And we've seen that happen too. Like, I do think that there is a difference between like wielding the 3-point shot as a credible threat and leaning on it as a crutch. And I thought this was a game where he leaned on it as a crutch. I don't just say that because he missed the threes. I felt like the whole game, it wasn't just Jokić, the whole team was really scared to go inside with Wemby. There was this possession in transition where Christian ends up having a wide open, it could have been like a reverse layup because Wemby's on the other side of the basket. He doesn't even look at the basket that possession. And I forget who he passes out to, but I believe Jamal, one other player, and then the possession ends with like a Hunter Tyson above the break three,
Mm.
Which is like it's an open look, but there were multiple times throughout that possession that guys had an opportunity in the paint that they not even turned down. They didn't even look at the basket that possession because Wemby was just on the floor. And I thought that that game was really, really tough. And I kind of was going back and forth with some people online about this, like, oh, this is the first time they've played Wemby. I'm like, yeah, this year, but they played him 4 times last season.
Yeah.
But, it has been a while, right? And it is a new team, like you sort of alluded to in terms of just combinations of personnel, figuring out how to play with each other. Um, so I in the end up cutting them a little bit more slack. And maybe I'm doing that because they end up winning the second Spurs game. I
Yeah.
do think that they were a lot more comfortable. In the first game, they took 39 threes as a team, which is a lot for this Denver Nuggets team that is dead last in 3-point frequency. 39 threes is above league average on a per game rate. I didn't look at the per 100 possessions or anything like that, but it was a lot of threes, and you could feel it in the moment thinking like, man, they're taking a lot of threes right now. And obviously they weren't making them. If they were making them, they would have won that game. Um, in the second game, I thought really the difference was just fewer turnovers. So they were just more comfortable operating, even if they were still not going at the rim quite as much. There were just fewer turnovers to give the Spurs like runouts and things like that. But defensively, I thought they did a much better job on Wemby in the second game.
Was huge because of Peyton Watson. I mean, we didn't have AG, and he was
Yeah.
sorely missed, because I mean, I don't know. Like, he's kind of like a paint player, too. He's been making his threes, of course, and it's like maybe he could have contributed to some more made threes by all these threes we were taking. But, you think of Aaron Gordon as a vertical spacer. I don't know how effective he would have been in that matchup necessarily,
He
or
would have been
how.
able to finish. The thing with like the first game, especially, he's not afraid
Yeah,
of
he's
taking shots in
unafraid.
the paint, at least. And he would have like gone at him, I
Yeah.
feel like.
And would have
In the
helped
se-
on the
yeah.
defensive end, too. But
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
but then not being afraid is a good point because, like, just to your point with all you're saying right now, like Wemby just existing makes everyone like rethink their approach, like pretty much. And I think Wemby, even though we played him a lot last year, and Jokić like changed up how we attacked him from game to game, there was like a nice little narrative, like Jokić went to the floater in the second time against him, and that worked really well. This time it wasn't as much, and he was leaning more on further shots away from the basket.
Yeah, like
And they,
long twos
yeah, or
and
threes, of
threes.
course. And they were
Yeah,
doubling him a lot of the times, even on that. And yeah, we just like tentative and just like really like overthinking it. And I think the team was like standing around being like, Jokić, go at Wemby, you can take him. And Jokić being like, I'm tired of doing this. Like, you guys cut. I want to hit you on a cut. Like, and
right.
it
He
was
was
just
definitely
like,
looking for cutters, and they weren't
yeah,
coming in the first game,
in the first
especially.
game. And it was a little bit better in that second game. And I think the whole team was more motivated, and every player kind of had a moment where they stepped up and he either hit some
Yeah,
shots that maybe they normally wouldn't have hit. But then, like, just to get back to your
had some
point,
big threes from Russ in that game for sure.
yeah. And just to get back to your point, like Peyton playing good defense on Wemby was
Yeah,
notable in the second game.
for sure. And that game went to overtime. Jokic actually had an open jumper that to take the lead, like at the buzzer in regulation, that he missed. And I'm like, he could actually make that shot. And he ended up making that shot in overtime. He's like, I'm making the shot. And I don't want to say that Jokic's jumper is bad or the fact that he's taking him is bad. I just think that a lot of these were like the ones in the first game, especially, they were like contested and like kind of out of rhythm. And like there was an opportunity to go inside. Um, and that's what I mean about the difference between, again, like wielding it as a credible threat and then um like the using it as a crutch. But the jumper has been great, like all season, and he's shooting over 50% from mid range. Obviously, almost 50% from three. His 3-point percentage has dipped a little bit in recent games, although he's not taking them as at quite as high volume recently. I'm curious to see if that continues. There's just been, he's been sick, some lineup changes
Yeah.
and things like that. But yeah, I thought in the second game, especially in OT, the team was a lot more composed versus Wemby. I felt like in the first game, it was a lot of like, man, we really need to win the minutes that he's off the floor in foul trouble, because he was just messing everything up for them offensively in that first game. And they were a little bit more composed in offense, and then they were able to lock down a bit better on defense. That first game, I will say, was another example of bad clutch defense. I don't think Peyton closed in that game. He definitely did close in the second one. I believe
Yeah,
between
that was
regulation
good.
and OT, he played the last 22 minutes straight. Malone was just like, we need you on Wemby. Like, just no, no one else can do this. Although I thought Russ actually did a pretty good job. Like, literally the
Oh,
smallest
yeah.
guy on our roster besides like Trey Alexander. He gave Wemby a lot of trouble, just like forcing
Yeah.
turnovers and things like that. But yeah, the Spurs game, it was an interesting sort of back to back, literally, but just like playing the same team twice in a row. And I thought those games were really good. Neither of them was national TV. And I know some people were talking about that. And I thought that was kind of weird because last year, I don't think any of the Spurs games were national TV either. But you'd think because Wemby got more national TV games, they would have made more of his games versus, team like the Nuggets got a decent number of national TV games this season. And I would have thought that if they're giving the Spurs more, they would have like made some of them just like ones versus really good teams. I think they had a national TV game against the Bucks last week. And the Bucks are
It
not as good of
wasn't
a
that.
team this year.
Yeah.
It was not good either. It
Yeah.
was a it was a blow.
Yeah. I was
I
going to
thought one of
say,
these games should have been on
yeah.
TV for
I was
sure.
going to say the NBA should learn to put Wemby matchups versus amazing big men's,
Yeah.
on
Well,
national
I
TV.
mean,
They'll learn
we've
from
done
it,
that.
but then they had that Bucks game where it was a little bit brutal.
Yeah.
But the Spurs are still, they're decent. They can win
Yeah, they're in
games,
the
but
play-in right now. Like
they're
they're
just
ahead of the Suns, and I believe they're either tied with the Kings in the standings right now, um, or maybe like a game behind them. They're ahead of the Warriors, I believe, right now too.
so they're still just a
Warriors are really
growing
slipped.
team. They're getting stuff together. But yeah, I mean, Castle is really good. Like just ball pressure, Devin Vassell has real athleticism. Chris Paul
He's
is
been more impressive
organizing.
defensively to me than offensively, Vassell, and
Yeah,
I know
that's
he's been
fair.
in and out with injuries, so that like the offense hasn't been as crisp.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
Shooting's been.
but I'm that's an interesting sort of Spurs storyline that I'm following is like because Vassell's really if you look at the roster, you'd think like based on the names of the players, like Vassell's their number two, but he has not been their second best player. Like it's not close, even when he does play. So yeah, that's interesting. But they do have like a really good core. They're a big team, bigger team now, I think, than last year with Sohan at power forward because they have Harrison Barnes at power forward, he's not big, but he's like you can play that guy at four. Like there's no you don't look at it and you're just like, oh, that guy's like way too small or whatever to um and they're long for sure. Like you can see it with all of the players. You can see it last year too. Like they definitely are a team that tries to build with a lot of length. Like they seem to prioritize that a lot. The only exception to that on the roster, I would think, is Chris Paul. And so it makes sense looking at that with Wemby's sort of leap that they've been able to make themselves a respectable defensive team. I actually think they're ahead of us right now. They're like 13th defensively. Makes a lot of sense with Wemby, but he's got some peripheral, help in that regard too. But it was an interesting 2-game series. All right. So the next game that happened was the Celtics without Jokić because both he and Derek White were listed as questionable, I believe, the day of the game with illness. And I thought, oh, like both of them will probably play. Then I thought maybe Derek White won't play. And then it turns out Jokić doesn't play either. So I thought he would play because Jokić like never misses games when he's healthy. But obviously he was not. And so Dario started in that game. And the Nuggets starters especially were actually like pretty good, like keeping the game competitive through like 3.5 quarters with the Celtics. Like we were just like right there basically the whole time. Um, then obviously the Celtics pulled away with it in the fourth quarter. It was a lot of turnovers, honestly. Like they were not turning the ball over for most of the game, and they were just like gave them an opportunity to like just gave them a chance to stay in it. But then with the turnovers in the fourth quarter, the Celtics were just scoring on runouts, and then it was like, okay, this is done now.
Yeah, it reminded me of the
Uh,
Mavs game where
yeah.
it's like you're out your best player, and I mean we weren't out our two best players, but still, you
I mean, we were
competitive.
out AG and
Yeah,
Jokic. That's two
yeah, that's
starters in
true.
the front court, the weakest probably part of the Nuggets rotation right now. So
Yeah, so you're
and I think that it's a
competitive.
fair. Oh, go
You're
ahead.
trying, and but then you don't have your best player to close out and keep.
Yeah,
When the game
you
slows
get
down,
outplayed
get
at
some
the end.
points.
Yeah,
So yeah, very similar
I actually thought
game.
Jamal was pretty good in that game. Like he was hitting all those shots versus the Celtics that we had in our Nuggets rewind over the summer, where Jamal like cooked the Celtics in that game in Boston last year. And I was kind of curious if this version of Jamal was even able to do that anymore. So it was really nice to see him like taking Jason Tatum off the dribble, getting all the way to the rim.
But he
Um,
still had like a lot of missed shots in that game because he was like pissed after that game. He was like,
he
"If I just
was. It was
made more
mostly
shots, we would have won."
It was mostly the turnovers in the fourth quarter and his missed shots. Like there were like two like big misses where it's like you need these to kind of like keep it in range. So those are probably the ones he's thinking of. But for the most part in this game, like he was hitting like everything. He was hitting threes. He was hitting stuff off pick and roll. He was doing. I think he had the exact same play where he gets a screen, ends up rejecting it and taking a step back three because Jason gets caught on it and he was getting downhill. Like he was just doing everything that we thought. And so that was nice to see. They're like, okay, he can still cook the Celtics for the most part in that game. And I will say the relevant stretch in the fourth quarter that the game like got away from them was when Jamal was off the floor and Russ was running things. And we've talked a lot about how Russ needs at least one of Jamal or Jokic on the floor to like be really effective. And not just that, but to just like not like those units collapse when you have Russ on the floor without both Jokić and Jamal. And everyone would be like, well, duh, like you're missing your two best players, things like that. It's not quite as bad when other players are running things. I do think that it's important that Russ has somebody to defer to. But anyway, it's not that all the turnovers in the fourth quarter were him, but some of the crucial ones were, and it was just like it didn't help. I thought Jamal was pretty good. It was a nice competitive effort. My only like observation about that game was like, thank you to the team for actually making that a game because it easily could have gotten away from them. Like when you think about the Celtics facing the Nuggets without Jokić, you're just like, this should be like a 40-point blowout. And it wasn't that. So
Yeah, they were real pissed about that outcome, and then came into the
yeah,
Clippers game and really wanted to win. So,
smacked him. So Jokić didn't play in that game either. And we were still without AG.
but
And
yeah,
the
I
other
mean,
mitigating factor
yeah, that's what I was gonna
we
say.
should talk about is that the Clippers were really out of it in this game, especially on offense. They were clearly, understandably distracted by the fact of the wildfires happening in LA. After this game, a bunch of their games in LA have been postponed. This is the case for both the Clippers and the Lakers. So it's been incredibly disruptive. I know like Kawhi didn't play in this game because he was back in LA tending to family, making sure that like people got evacuated and things like that. So this was a back-to-back win for sure. Another like blowout for the Nuggets at home on a back-to-back. But that was another mitigating factor for sure.
Yeah, it was hard to know what to take away from it because it was like clearly
Yeah.
the Clippers didn't give a shit about this game. And even Nick Batum said in an interview, he was like, I was checking my phone like 3 minutes until tip off. Like I was not even thinking
Yeah.
about the game. And so, it is what it is. The Nuggets did have like a intensity to them though, despite that.
Yeah. And I will
Um,
say, like, not half, but a good chunk of our roster is also from LA and or has family in
yeah.
that area as well.
Yeah. Like
Um,
Russ talked about it and he was amazing in
Russ
that
for
game.
sure.
He has that extra
DJ
motivation
and
to attack
Peyton
the Clippers.
also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought Russ,
So
it was funny him like attacking like Norm Powell and Zubac. Like he was like, I'm going to go at you and like try and score to mix
yeah.
results. But he was like super intense and like trying to hype up the crowd. And like it was an interesting game, but definitely had sad undertones to it. But you were
Yeah,
impressed with
for sure.
Jamal in the game?
I really was impressed with Jamal. I think Russ was really good, like energy wise in the second half. But I think he wasn't actually that great in the first half. There were just a lot of like turnovers and like kind of like those like remembering it's Russell Westbrook kind of plays. But Jamal was the engine of like everything in this game. I really truly believe that his approach both in the Celtics game and in this Clippers game was like, I'm in charge of making sure that we can win this game without Jokić. And he doesn't always take that approach. Like he hasn't always taken that approach. We talked about that with CT last episode, how his aggression and just general um, taking responsibility for the team on court, on ball, has been different in the games where he has been his best. And it wasn't just scoring in this game, which he was. Like he was hitting his turnaround jumpers, he was hitting his transition threes. Like we took a lot of threes in this game. That was one of the big differences when you have Jokić out is that we do take a lot of threes, and they happened to be making them in this game, so that was good. But it's one of those things where I wonder if it was an emphasis coaching wise because they're thinking, okay, we're at a bit of a talent deficit in this game, so let's try to like game the numbers a little bit, um, try to play the math game, and they did, and it worked. I think they shot almost 50% from three as a team. Um, and a lot of that was coming off of like drives from Jamal. There was this like beautiful handoff that Jamal has to Julian in transition. But yeah, he was just getting in the paint and playmaking out of that for everybody. Dump offs to DJ, lobs to DJ. Obviously, he's been getting these really tough um, lobs over the second level of the defense to Pwat cutting after like they tagged DJ on the short roll, but Jamal's able to make that pass. I know in what I forget which game it was in where Jamal hits DJ on the short roll, and DJ makes the lob pass to cutting Peyton Watson in one of these games. But Jamal has also been able to hit that from, from the top of the key when they tag DJ, and that's the Jamal Peyton connection has definitely been like a pleasant sort of recurring surprise in recent weeks. I'm not sure if you've noticed some of those plays.
He had 9 assists in that game.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
think it was
been
only 2 turnovers too.
2 turnovers, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like Jamal's just slowly been building up 4 or 6 from 3 in that game. The previous 2 against Boston and the Spurs win, he only hit 1 3 in each of those games, but his shot was getting better. His facilitating was getting better. I think you and CT talked about how Jamal's been facilitating more, and you'd been liking that. Of course, then we have the Brooklyn game, and he has knee inflammation in the middle of that game and has to leave. And then even in the Mavs game, was seemingly struggling in the first half. We'll get to that, but he finished that game strong. So it's sad to see that as soon as he's building momentum, then he's having to take a step back. But
Feels like the season, honestly.
I know and that's like the thing with a lot of these games with Jokić out and AG out and Jamal going in and out in the middle of games too is I don't want to make excuses for when the Nuggets are putting in poor effort or starting games slow. Like you had this stat, which I don't know if you want to cover later, but the 30th ranked defense in the first quarter, we always just start really slow and don't have that intensity. But I don't know how much it is like we're changing up lineups and the team doesn't know how to get into a flow when AG's coming off the bench. Like, how does that work? How does that look? We haven't done that really ever. So that's a little awkward. And then we finally am able to figure it out over the course of a game. It's frustrating to watch as a fan, but I'm going to start defaulting to if we're down by 20 in the first half or even in the third quarter, I'm still going to think we might make a run and get into a competitive game at the end. That's what you
have to do at this point. Yeah, that's basically, the Nets game, they won the Jokić minutes. They didn't win the non-Jokić minutes. I will say the non-Jokić minutes were less damaging when Jamal played in those units in the first half. I believe they were -5 in about 5 minutes with DJ on in the first half of that game. And then obviously Jamal goes out after halftime. And then you had Russ and DJ running the bench in the second half, and they were -9 in 3.5 minutes. So I do think that Jamal is, whether he's playing well or not, just is a stabilizing presence on those bench units. And even when he's not playing well, because we see it even in the Mavs game, those bench units with Jamal just on the floor are more helpful, whether Russ is there or not. So obviously Russ can contribute too, but I think you have to have Jamal there. But yeah, it does suck that every time he sort of starts to gain some momentum, it's he had the concussion at the beginning of the season, and then he had the hamstring tightness, and I think he missed a game, maybe 2. I'm surprised that hasn't come back up again. So hopefully that was a while ago. So I'm not really worried about it. Now it's the knee soreness. And this is a recurring thing. He's talked about this being a thing ever since the ACL surgery. But yeah, then let's talk a bit more about the Mavs game that just happened yesterday. They start slow. The AG coming off the bench because he's on a minutes restriction coming back from his calf strain. The AG DJ minutes were money. AG was hitting a bunch of jumpers in this game, and people have pointed out that he's taking more jumpers and having to make them, and he is making them at a decent clip this season. Because our spacing is so not great with our personnel in terms of having shooters that allow AG to play more on the interior.
But I
thought AG was just great. Both ends. Just having him back as a low man was oh my gosh, they stopped somebody at the rim. That's incredible.
Yeah. Him just being there and hitting those turnaround jumpers and hit the face up 3. He does those things. He always contributes and shows up every night. I know he sometimes has struggles, but even in those games where he struggles, he does 1 or 2 things that are really impactful, and we just need him for sure. And I mean, we're going to talk about the starting unit and Russ and if AG and Russ are good fits and all that, but it was still really good to see him back. And I
Yeah.
was hoping that he would come off the bench just because I do want to like play him in limited minutes coming back because he's already re-aggravated this calf. And so you don't want that again.
Yeah.
So it's good to see.
Right. AG was definitely pouring in points. Like he hits a step back three over Kleber, just kind of like sizes him up and then gets the space and nails that. I love seeing AG's three going in. Uh it's interesting because like I'm watching the bench and there's definitely possessions with like the young guys that I'm like, man, I wish we had some more like organized stuff for them. Sometimes like when things get kind of chaotic. But especially with like Jamal and AG and MPJ, I'm just like, they could just try shit because I have like very low expectations for the bench offense anyway. Like I kind of don't care if it's efficient. I just need points to like go on the board.
I know. Yeah.
Um, so it's interesting AG coming off the bench. Like he takes that step back three with Jokić on the floor, and I'm just like, it's one of those shots, even if he makes it. But because it was with the bench, and especially because he's playing next to DJ and he has to be more of a spacer because he definitely can't play the dunker spot with DJ on the floor. And they had the ball in AG's hands a lot more in this game. They had a nice like 4-5 pick and roll where AG lobs it over to DJ and it just like rocked the place. I don't know if Mavs fans were watching that and they're like, what the hell? In this game versus the Mavs, very slow start from the team, like you mentioned. I thought Jamal was really like a massive culprit in that because, like you said, the 30th ranked defense in first quarters that's just how this team has been. But the offense hasn't really lagged that much until this game. I thought Jamal was really slow on his passing reads, especially. And I don't think that actually changed too much throughout the game. It's just his scoring was a little bit better in the second half. But I know Malone talked about like, oh, he's not totally healthy. I'm like, well, why is he on the floor playing?
Yeah, that was an interesting Bennett Durando like reported on that, too.
I mean, that was what Malone said in the post game presser.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I do think that in the Bennett piece, it was pretty clear that like Jamal wants to be on the floor, but I'm just like, I don't actually know the full politics of this stuff. But when a player is like hurt like that, you have to be able to just take them off the floor.
I know there's that whole thing where Jamal's like this warrior who he can play through injuries and he's tough. But I don't
And
know.
he
I
like
don't know how
keeps
you
wanting
feel, but
to.
I want him to just rest if he's hurt.
I was having this conversation with some people yesterday about Jamal's season last year, and it felt like they were a lot more cautious with him than they're being this year, both with the minutes and like the games played whenever these like little nicks and injuries come up. And it feels like maybe they looked at last year and they were like, well, we rested you a lot and you still had all this like stuff come up and it was like
Hmm.
recurring and whatever. And you also weren't ready for the playoffs. So like we don't really see like a reason to like do that again. It's almost like what they did with what the Clippers did with Kawhi last year, where it's just like you're playing.
Yeah.
After we tried the load management thing and it didn't work, and we can't have you missing like 20 plus games again this season. Yeah, and I do think that the difference in the second half, bench comes back in again, like AG is really big with that, but also it was like the stagger minutes of the bench players, especially Peyton with Jokić, was really big because of Peyton's ability to impact things defensively. The AG and DJ bench with Jamal and I think Julian and it's either Julian and MPJ or Julian and Peyton come in and they're doing a lot of really good things as well. Jamal started hitting some jumpers in the fourth quarter too. He hit a transition pull up three. I love how he's not hesitating on that now. I do like it's one of those like no yes shots. Like it's great that he's making them, obviously, but I just want Jamal generally to take more threes. And if the only way that we get him to do that is by taking the transition pull up jumpers, then I guess that's what I have to live with.
I was just tweeting that during the game. I mean, I think a lot of people were just wanting Jamal to shoot more threes because you only have to make 37%, 40%. Like if you're not hitting half of them, it's fine. Just shoot it. If you make one, that's 3 points in your bag. And like, I was like, just shoot it off the handoff or a screen, even if you're like kind of off balance. Just like go for it rather than driving into Lively and getting nothing out of it and getting blocked or whatever at the rim. He just isn't if he's coming back from this knee inflammation, he's not going to be as explosive driving. So I'm like, just shoot it, because he's had success in
Yeah.
recent stretches where he's making more threes. Like, I feel like I'm less worried about his three than anything else in his game. And I don't know if that's
Yeah.
wrong or
Like, I'm not at
rational,
all.
but
I remember this question from Matt Moore when we had him on the show before the season. We were talking about the Nuggets 3-point volume question mark, right? Issues, problem, whatever you want to call it. Uh, and I think he asked, like, I think it was in the conversation about Jamal, actually, where we're like, well, what if he goes 2 of 12 from 3? And I'm like, he took 12 threes? That's awesome. Like, that's how
yeah,
I would actually feel about it, because I don't I don't is there a game where Jamal has taken 12 threes?
I don't
That would
know.
be amazing.
He had
That
9
the
against the
other thing,
Pelicans, and he made 2 of them. So,
yeah,
but
yeah. And those were big. That felt like a great Jamal game, actually,
yeah.
versus the Pelicans.
But I'm like,
The most recent Pelicans game, not
I've
the
just
first one.
been like, I don't know if I'm crazy for trying to advocate for him, like tailoring his shot diet a little bit and just biasing it more towards
Not
three and
crazy
not
at
just
all.
not taking mid ranges at all. But what do I know? Because I
I don't
thought it
think it's
was,
crazy at all. Like, look at what doing that has done for Tyler Hero.
mm,
Like, the Heat's offense is 10 points per 100 better with him on the floor than off. Like, he is the engine of whenever they're able to create efficient offense now.
yeah,
Because he's been able to tailor his shot diet and also improve his playmaking, right? Like, that's definitely a part of it. But the fact that he is such a threat from deep opens up more easy playmaking opportunities. This is something that I noticed in that Clippers game where Jamal was the engine of everything, because he wasn't hesitating from three. Instead of coming off a pick and roll and driving inside and trying to create an interior passing angle to the big, if he's ready, shot ready from deep, the defense is staying with him and leaving DJ open in the middle of the floor, which makes the pass to him even easier because you're not as crowded, because
hmm
you're further out, right? And I think that is something that I felt was a lot, like in the 2023 playoffs, because I was a new, like, sort of member of the Nuggets fan base, whatever. I didn't know that Jamal, like, doesn't like to take threes or like whatever. He was taking a bunch of threes in those playoffs, and it
hmm
opened up a ton of playmaking opportunities for him. I haven't looked at the numbers to see the frequency, but it didn't feel like his shot diet was like that big of a problem. Maybe because he was making
yeah,
his mid range jumpers and whatever, but he was willing to shoot from further out, which meant there were so many opportunities where they were either like hedging on him, and creating a really easy passing angle to Jokić that enhanced that two-man game. And now we see it whenever he's doing it more with, I think, DeAndre Jordan than he does with Jokić, because he's always trying to drive in to create that interior passing angle to Jokić. But you can do that easier if you're actually operating from further, if you're operating from further out. But you have to be willing to take that shot and force your defender to stay with you there in order to create that. Because otherwise, they're playing further off of Jamal. This is something that we've seen, even with, like, earlier in the season. Like, Russ is on the ball, and you've got everyone pinching in from everywhere. And it's not that Jamal's not a 3-point threat; it's that his defender knows that he wants to drive instead.
yeah, yeah. If he can raise the stakes of his 3-point shot, it could open up, other parts of his game. I mean, right now, like, he's coming around any action. It's really easy for a defender to kind of be in a soft-ish drop and contain
Yeah.
Jokić and him and make the pocket pass harder. And he's
I will say
settling
the
for,
fact that so many defenders drop on him creates more opportunities to switch smaller defenders onto Jokić, which is what happens a
yeah,
lot,
they need to take
actually.
advantage of that for sure. And Jamal did do good, like in the Spurs game, like when that happened, like dribbling out and taking his time and
Yes, he's like,
letting
"Oh, I got the
Jokić
big
dive
switch onto
in.
me. Like, I'm gonna dribble out and pull him out, and then get the entry pass to Jokić there, for sure." I will say one of the things that the Mavs tried in this game was a double big coverage with Maxi Kleber and Derek Lively. And we've seen different iterations of, like, okay, put the like chunkier big on Jokić, and then have the rim protecting big like roaming and like all of that chunkier. In this one, it reminded me of the way that the Lakers like to guard at the end of games, like to guard the Nuggets at the end of the games, and even though it literally never works. uh, where they have LeBron on Jamal, or maybe no, they had LeBron on Jokic, and so that they could switch LeBron onto Jokic, or like switch the chunkier guy onto Jokic. So in this case, it was Kleber on Jokic with Lively on the guard so that they could switch that pick and roll. And that was the case for both Jamal and Russ. And the Nuggets sort of punished that first with Jokic getting some offensive rebounds over Lively after, like, I think Russ ended up taking a jumper, and then like Jokic gets an offensive rebound over him. That happened twice. And then which I don't love the idea of like Russ taking a jumper and we're kind of relying on Jokic to get the offensive rebound. Another thing that happened twice in this coverage, I think once was in the first half, another was in the second half. Jamal ends up ISOing Kleber, and one of the times he kind of gets stonewalled, like trying to drive on him. And like you said, with the knee, he clearly isn't as explosive driving even than he normally is, which isn't that explosive, right? But in the first half, he gets an ISO 3 from the top of the key. And I think what he was trying to do was like back up, like pull Kleber out and try to get a passing angle to Jokic. But I think Lively was kind of maybe like wrapping him up, whatever, and would have like deflected it. So Jamal ends up just taking the pull up three, and he drills it, right? Because Kleber's going to give him a ton of space on that shot. Because he's playing him for the drive, right? That's the other thing, is like, because they know Jamal likes to drive, he's getting a ton of space on these jump shots. And so he may as well make them threes instead of twos.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But yeah, and then like obviously, like I said, Jamal was he hit a couple of jump shots in that fourth quarter. And I think they either tied it or they gave him the lead in those minutes before Jokic comes back onto the floor. And then the Nuggets were able to actually hold the lead defensively in the second half, and win that game kind of going away. Part of that, I think, was because Peyton Watson closed. We're going into the clutch, and Jamal's not on the floor because he needed to take a quick break after he had played with the bench. So it was Peyton and Christian and Russ and PJ and Jokic on the floor. So AG didn't close. He was only playing the bench minutes. They're really trying to adhere to his minutes restriction this time. And I want to keep seeing that, because they did go over on a couple of games the last time. And I think that might have been part of re-aggravating the calf. But we got Peyton on the floor. Then Jamal comes back in, and he's coming back in for Christian. So Peyton got to close at that 2-guard spot. I think that was really important for holding the defense, honestly. What do you think of how that game ended?
Yeah, we were just like switching more and making things a little more simpler, I think, and challenging the Mavs to have to try to ISO to create stuff. And it's just, they just didn't have enough firepower and talent without like Kyrie and Luka. That's usually the people who create advantages for them, to keep up with the Nuggets. And man, we were this close to, my takes, or, my attitude and opinions on the team would have been a lot worse if we lost that game. But it's just more typical Nuggets of taking way too long to figure out how to get the offense going. And if once we got it going, it's easier to then play better on defense and get some stops. And, the second halves of the Mavs were really terrible on offense and just not scoring at all.
Who was killing us in this game was Klay Thompson, your old buddy.
I know, it was horrible. Just not running out and closing out on him no matter what. And I
thought it was really difficult to have Christian guarding him, honestly, because it's literally just all screen navigation off ball.
Yeah.
And Klay was just getting open. So you were just kind of like hoping that he was like washed enough to miss these shots, but like all of them were wide open.
I know.
In the second half, I think they had more of like Russ and Jamal and Peyton on him, guys who can kind of get around screens a little bit better. On one of the passes to Klay, Peyton just intercepted it. It was so he's not running off of screens or anything. Klay isn't. But I think it was off an offensive rebound maybe, and like Spencer Dinwiddie drives and tries to kick out to Klay, and Peyton is on him and he intercepts the pass, like catches it pretty high up, and then gets to drive the other way. That was really nice to see. Like Peyton, I thought, really popped in this game. He ended up being a plus 30.
Yeah, that's wild.
In this game. I think part of that was like he got to play a lot in the minutes that Jamal didn't in the stagger with Jokic. And those were great minutes for the team because Jamal was struggling so much defensively. And he played a lot in the bench minutes where, like, even though Jamal's on the floor, like AG and DJ were just like really impactful defensively on top of Peyton. Like, obviously, he was really important to this. And that's the reason that he closed in this game. But I thought that was definitely notable. We should really talk about just the general Nuggets point guard situation. So, like you've mentioned, after we've gone through our sort of game by game breakdown, Jamal's been hit or miss again, right? He was bad in both Spurs games, like no question, particularly scoring. I didn't think his passing was actually that bad. It just didn't like pop. Uh, he was great versus both the Celtics and the Clippers. I thought he's mad at himself for missing a couple shots in the Celtics game, but I thought that other than that, like he's the reason that they were, neck and neck with the Celtics throughout this entire game, just being the engine of the offense. And then in the Clippers game, they get a blowout win with him as the main engine of the offense for sure. One of the things with that Clippers game that I just want to point out was the variety of ways that Jamal was creating for others. I think a lot of people point to like, okay, he had his 20 points, it was pretty efficient, but combining that with the distribution that I'm really looking at. We've been talking throughout the whole season about this, like Jamal is a combo guard and what it means to be the point guard for this team when he also has this like scoring first, when you think about it, role that he's in different phases of the game. So I talked about the lob passes that he gets to Peyton behind the defense, and those are always really fun because you're like, wow, this possession looks broken, but it turns out there is an open pass available to a cutting Peyton back there. And sometimes he'll hit them from like 30 feet out. And I'm like, those are actually like, he's a really good lob passer, Jamal is. And it makes you wonder, he looks really good when he's playing next to DJ in that sense, and even AG. It makes you wonder how his development would have been different if Jokić was like a lob threat, or if they had other lob threats on the roster throughout those like earlier years of Jamal's development. Because you're kind of wondering, like, where did he learn how to lob pass like
Yeah,
this?
he's very like
Actually,
accurate and has good touch on them. Like maybe he could do some of
because
that
the
with
Nuggets didn't
AG or
get like
something. I don't
super
know.
athletic until 2023, from my understanding of the rosters post Kenneth Reed. Is
Yeah.
that
I mean, you had
an
like
accurate
Jeremy
assessment?
Grant and who was a
Okay.
vertical spacer, but I didn't. It's not like Jamal was lobbing it to him. So
Right.
yeah, it's been
Yeah,
interesting.
so you kind of wonder like where did all that come from? Because in 2023 they put it all together in those playoffs. There were lots of like lob dunks to AG, to Bruce, to Christian for sure, right? And now we're seeing it with Peyton and DJ. There was that handoff pass to Julian in transition where he basically fakes out the defense, makes it look like he's going to keep and drive as the defense thinks that he likes to do. So that's another way that he can weaponize the way that defenders guard him. And I think he was in like transition, semi-transition, gets Julian a wide open three, and I believe Julian nailed that shot. Um, Drives and dump offs to DJ out of pick and roll for sure. He was getting downhill, I feel like, a lot more in this game, and he was definitely kicking out some, but there were also interior passes that were open to him because he was getting downhill. To the point where like that in combination with his shot making in that game, where he was hitting his turnarounds, he was hit all his fadeaway shots, he was hitting his transition pull up threes, as we like to see him even take in the first place. The Clippers started blitzing him, and like we've seen in other games where the Nuggets are playing without Jokić, where Jamal is playing without Jokić in particular, he gives up the ball, and often the possession will like stagnate after that because the Nuggets just aren't good at playing in advantage situations for whatever reason. Sometimes we do need to get better at playing out of those. But I do think in that game he was good about giving the ball up and then getting it back. And being in a situation where it was difficult for the Clippers to blitz him. And also, they know we've seen it in previous games. So it's like, well, there's no Jokić here. Like, whatever outlet he's going to have isn't as good. And sometimes they get stuff out of that, sometimes they don't. I talked about the one game where, he ends up passing to DJ, who gets tagged on the short roll, and then DJ makes the lob pass to Peyton, right? But that doesn't always happen. um,
Hmm.
especially when they blitz Jamal like pretty far out, which is why it's important that he plays with someone else who can play out of those blitzes. I think that that's one of the reasons that the Russ and Jamal bench lineups have thrived this season. Um, and especially when the two of them have MPJ out there too as a spacer and just like another option to pass out to in those situations. But all of that was happening because of his downhill aggression early. And so they did have advantages that were created out of that. And so I was just like really impressed with his like he had this very good all around offensive game in the Clippers, and then two stinkers that followed because of his knee. Versus the Mavs, I do want to give like a harsher criticism here because regardless of the knee, I just thought his processing speed was really slow in that game. And it's a big reason that they had such a slow start offensively. He was just missing a lot of easy passing reads to Jokić because he was like taking so long to process what was going on with the defense. It was like watching a rookie out there where it's like, is the game going too fast for him kind of thing? But obviously we know that's not true. It's his seventh year in the NBA,
Yeah, is
right?
he like just he's the injury or if it's pain or whatever is like first on his mind or something, and he's just not like playing freely or what? What's happening? You know?
It's one of the things is like Jamal needs to be better at some of these marginal things. Like he needs to get sharper at it because if he is going to play, well, at least four more years in the NBA because he's under contract for another 4 years after this one, with the Nuggets right now. Uh, he's gonna have times where he's injured, right, and trying to play through injury and trying to impact the game in other ways, and needs to be like my like dream is that he gets to the point of like point guard play of like a Mike Conley or close to it, like 90% of a Mike Conley, within the next like year or two, because then it won't matter when you have these like stinkers, scoring wise and all of that, because you'll be able to just set other guys up more and just play like a smarter brand of basketball. And it's just weird because we saw him do that to like a really high level versus the Clippers, who are great defense, right? And he was healthy in that game. Like he wasn't having the knee soreness in that game. Uh, but then like completely forgot like every part of offense versus the Nets, and then well, definitely versus the Mavs.
Well, I mean, this is partly why we wanted to, hone in on this point guard position with the Nuggets specifically because, Russ, we'll talk more about him, but the way that, I mean, not only is Jamal kind of struggling and coming back from an injury postseason and offseason, now he's having to like learn how to like exist next to Russ. And it's not like it's bad. Like those minutes have been good as we've seen, like the
Hmm.
stats and everything. But it's just like now we're talking about him being relegated more to off ball minutes because Russ is better on ball. And, we have mixed results with him getting to spots off ball and off screens and such versus him like ball handling. And I think that that's going to lean more towards him having success the more he embraces that. I don't know how many, I don't know if Russ is actually going to start or not. Like we'll talk about that soon. But, like if he does start, Jamal is going to have to play much more off ball and stuff like that. And I'll be interested to see how it shapes out and how he looks. But it's like a tough
I mean, we're kind of
philosophical
seeing it now
change.
with Russ starting in place
Yeah,
of another
definitely.
starter,
It'll
right?
just continue to grow. And like, I'm imagining more of those types of things happening as time goes on and Jamal having to do that. But it's just weird because it's like what used to be the best two-man game in the league, Jamal and Jokić is the most reliable kind of play. Obviously different now because you don't have KCP in the other corner spacing. You have, Aaron Gordon in a dunker and then Russ off ball, and that's going to mess up the spacing. And Jamal's going to drive into a wall or drive into aimlessly around the court or not having an open pocket pass to Jokić. Like this spacing is affecting everyone on the team, like from AG. I mean, Mike and Jokić are having fine. They're having success spacing just because they create it for themselves. They can shoot it and all that stuff. But this is just going to be a question, going on. If Russ does start, I'm like, what does Jamal's role really look like? Even though I think it is fine and works a lot of the time. But yeah, if you want to get into like how Jamal, like that problem, if you want to even talk about it or just talk about Russ, we can dive into some of that.
Well, I mean, Russ has been playing really, really well lately, particularly with the starters because everybody plays well with the starters, right? Uh, I don't know if we've talked about this on the show before, but Russ might be like the biggest Jokic merchant of all time. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean if you look at the splits with Jokic on versus off the floor, like Russ's splits, it's stark. You'd think like, okay, maybe there's some shooting variance there. He's shooting about 32% from three, both on with Jokic on and off the floor. So that's not really it. At the rim, Russ is shooting, I believe, 72% at the rim with Jokic on the floor and like 50% at the rim with Jokic off.
Yeah. I guess, Jokic just easier to get that, better looks around the rim, when Russ is playing with
Because the
him.
defense is so worried about him
Yeah.
that
And
you
just,
end up getting
and Jokic's
that
ability
driving lane.
to hit him in like more
Yeah.
advantage situations with cutting to the rim and
That's
dunking
true.
and
He
stuff
gets
like
more
that.
of those like wide open layups, not necessarily ones that he creates for himself, whereas he's creating all of the ones for himself when Jokic is off the floor.
Yeah. Which is harder to finish, but Russ's
But
athleticism
50%, yeah, yeah, for
is
sure.
still finishing them, which is great. I mean, I could imagine a world where he was playing with Jokic and smoking layups, and he's not doing that, which is amazing. But,
So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means for Russ to close certain games, which I think is very relevant for the playoffs. But there has been this conversation of should Russ start because he benefits just because he's a Jokic merchant doesn't mean he shouldn't start because maybe the argument is like if we're going to get the most out of this guy, we should play him as much with Jokic as possible. What's your thought on the question of whether Russ should start?
oh man, it is tough because it's like no matter who you're putting, uh, who like you're starting Russ maybe over Christian, for example. And that sounds good because then Christian, you're like, oh, Christian's coming off the bench. And that's what we've kind of been missing because he was a great kind of rotation piece off the bench, even though I thought he struggled off the bench last year. And every player is going to benefit from playing like more with the starters, whether it's Christian, Russ, or Pwat, who could also be in the conversation of starting. Like everyone's just going to be more productive in that way. So like I'm in favor of maybe trying it out, but it's so hard because I feel bad for Christian and like I think but sometimes I think about I don't know. I'm kind of lower on the start Russ bandwagon just because I think he has like a good attitude and approach. I think if you can rotate him into Jokic minutes more off the bench, that's great. And I don't know. It's just so
I
tough. His stats are so good; it's hard to deny. But like some
I
people,
mean, it's not that hard. You
okay,
can just say no.
but yeah, some people like as good as Russ have been, I thought have a good argument that I've seen going around in discussions is that Russ just the way he plays and the philosophical way that he plays pushes the Nuggets identity in a certain way where, obviously the pace is increased. It's a lot of rim uh attempts because, he's cutting to the rim. He's not a volume 3-point shooter, stuff like that. And there are ways to mitigate like his spacing concerns in his three by, having him screen or cut and what have you. But it just is changing the style of offense that you're wondering if it's like too risky to like
Yeah.
commit to in a starting way down the line.
Yeah, I think I agree with that in part. Like that's definitely one of the reasons because you're not sure how it'll actually shake out down the line. Like we have a really nice it's not that we have a small sample size, but that's what it is. Like it's a few weeks of Russ playing really well with the starters in the regular season, largely against some like not great teams. I was really impressed that he played well versus the Mavs yesterday. Like that definitely mattered to me. I thought he was actually good throughout that game. I didn't think that he was consistently good in past games against good teams. Even with Jokic on the floor, he was making a lot of mistakes, but particularly with Jokic off, right? But we're talking about if he's starting, he's playing more with Jokic. And I think that that is probably the best argument for starting Russ
Yeah.
is like we're going to get the most out of him because we'll get more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff because he's playing with Jokić. But it's not that I feel bad for CB. I just think that starting Russ full time is not something you can just try out because it's really hard to walk back from that, right? Like just sort of in terms of like player politics stuff. If it ends up not going well and you need to go back to Christian starting or even Peyton starting, then you're like, okay, I gotta get the 36-year-old who played really well, played himself into a starting position, and then it's not working. It's like, how much runway do you give him? And Malone likes to give guys a lot of runway, especially vets that try as hard as Russ does. I don't think it's a good idea to start him really just for that reason. Because basketball wise, there's a lot of reasons to want that to happen. One of the things that I've been tracking all season, and we talked about it on our lineups show, is Russ and Peyton playing together. Those minutes are not good. Even with Jokić on the floor, you're talking about like single digit positive like net ratings where you need to be closer to like 10 plus in all those minutes with Jokić just to maximize them. With Jokić off the floor, it's just like, oh my god, like the worst two-man net rating since Russ and Dario, right? um, and if Russ is starting, you separate those guys a bit more because Peyton is playing more in those bench units without Russ, and even like depending on Russ's like substitution pattern, maybe Peyton is playing in uh, um, those stagger minutes with Jokić as well. Jamal's going to start. That's the other thing about this is like maybe you're like, oh, with Christian, it's like, well, no, Jamal's going to start, and that's not changing. And actually, we need to figure out how to make that work. One of the things I've been looking at all season is like, how good is the starting lineup? We don't have a ton of data about that because of all the time that AG has missed. But before AG went out with the second time with the calf strain, it was clear that in the month of December, the starters' offense was really sputtering, actually, and they were not winning their minutes. That's again before AG's, and they barely played in December. It's a very small game sample size and all of that, but it kind of made me think like, "Ugh, maybe the coaching staff is like, we need a little bit of a spark here just to kind of like get us through this." But that that um that lineup data was very concerning to me, and it still is. And I'm curious what things are going to look like once AG does return to the starting lineup because he did come off the bench in this last game. Um, because we have to make our starting lineup work. Like our starting lineup has to be good. And whether that means like changing the starters or just playing better, right? Like I would like to make sure that the five guys we started the season with can play really well together because they started off like a plus 18 and now they're like at a plus 8 on the season, which tells you that they've definitely petered out.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be one of the things again in favor of like the starting unit needs a bit of a bump.
A
But I
boost.
think a lot of that has to do with Jamal. And the fact of the matter is we're not winning a championship if Jamal doesn't like get back to a more competent level consistently because we just need him to in order to beat playoff level defenses. As good as Russ has been, I see him as more of a at least with Jokić raising the floor of like okay, we can do a lot of really good stuff with this guy on the floor when Jamal is not at 100. Whether Jamal is there or not, like the Russ plus Jokić duo is really good. But in terms of what's going to happen with those lineups in a playoff setting, like a Russ, Christian, AG trio with MPJ and Jokić is like, that's not doing anything offensively
Yeah, I don't
against a
want
team
that.
like the Mavs or the Wolves in an actual playoff series, right? So the impetus for wanting Russ to start, I think, should be more of a motivation to make sure that we can get the other things working. Um, but I do want to talk a little bit more about Russ closing because I've had a lot of mixed feelings about Russ closing games this season, in particular because of what it does to the offense. But the defense with Russ on the floor in place of either Christian or Jamal has been pretty good. Um, in this stretch of games, we had a bunch of close games and clutch games, and those have been the ones where I'm most concerned about the offense with Russ, because that's when the game slows down. That's when other teams can scheme a little bit more effectively, just because everybody's in place. We're not, worrying about transition or semi-transition and guys getting in cross matches and all of that in these close games between the two Spurs games, the Nets game, and the Mavs game. The Nets didn't actually, I don't think, reach the clutch, but it was close for a bit after the Nets made a run to cut the lead down, and the Nuggets had to kind of slow play it and get things back under control. And they closed with Russ because Jamal had to leave that game, or they closed with Russ only because Jamal had to leave that game. And I thought the main difference between the games where it has worked with Russ closing, like the offense has worked with Russ closing, and not, is that Russ has been on ball, right? In that first Spurs game, there was that viral clip going around of the last offensive possession for the Nuggets where they were down one. They needed a bucket to take the lead. And Jokić ends up, he posts up Wemby. And then I believe it's Keldon Johnson leaves Russ in the corner to go double him, to go double Jokić in the post. And Jokić is trying to find the open corner shooter, and it's Russ because MPJ is screening. I'm just like, what is going on in this final play? It's kind of a disaster. And then he ends up turning the ball over to Devin Vassell. It was like way off target pass too. Like he wasn't even close to getting it to Russ or whatever. But all of that. There's a bunch of layers of what happens in that play, right? First of all, Jokić is trying to post up Wemby, and he started to pass the ball even before Keldon Johnson comes over to double, is the other thing. Because he's like, I don't have the angle to get a shot on this guy right now. Two, why is Russ the one in the corner spacing with MPJ screening for him?
I know.
Like, what is going on here? Three, Jamal was open at the top of the key because his guy was kind of pinching it on Jokić too. And Jokić ends up like throwing the ball the other way. And then his pass is off target, and Devin Vassell picks it off. They get a run out on the other end. Spurs ends up winning that game. I thought that in the second Spurs game, the one that goes to overtime, in regulation, we had more of Jamal Jokić two-man game, but it was Jokić operating out of the middle of the floor. It's not so much like him on the block or trying to get down to like deep in the paint. So like I said, he had that opportunity with to take a jumper to tie. And I thought the Spurs just did a good job with their hedging and recovering so that Wemby was always able to stay on Jokić. So that was whatever. But in overtime, in addition to they had a bunch of defensive stops, so they were getting out in transition more to score in overtime. They had a lot of Russ on the ball, running two-man game with Jokić, and then cutting off of him and getting open layups on the back end. And that's the exact same thing that happened in the Mavs game and the Nets game to close. How do you feel about what that could look like with Russ more on ball, closing games in a playoff setting?
I mean, it's nerve-wracking to think about, but if he's going to have success in that setting, he's got to be on ball because there's just too many ways to exploit it otherwise, I think. And just like that's why this is so hard to decide about, like, should he start or not and all that. Like, I get, it's a regular season thing and we're trying to get as many wins in the regular season as we can. We want to be a high seed so that we can compete. And Russ is bringing that to the table and helping us win games. And he's putting up a lot of stats. The production's good, especially next to Jokić. But with these injuries, with AG being out and being able to start Russ, which is, we wouldn't even really know what this would look like if that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why it's just so hard for Malone to like be super intentional about, like maybe he should have had Julian in on that last Spurs play when we lost, or, it's easy to say in retrospect and it's very obvious. Like, yeah, you need like a spacer there because, they kind of screwed us in a way. And I know Jokić took responsibility for that.
But also like maybe Russ could have been screening for Mike.
Yeah,
Because
sure,
like Mike
sure.
wasn't
Yeah,
even
that's a
acting
good
as a
point.
spacer on that final play. He was like,
Yeah. It was, again, I still
this is
think it
like what
was,
happens when you also have like AG out and like, okay, Mike's it's like I'm playing the 4. So like this is what AG would do for me. I
oh
don't
my
know.
God.
Like I don't like that was
Well,
like
that's a big question about
there were layers there.
how to like do this point guard situation. Who's the 2 and who's the 1 is, AG and Mike. And like, Mike's been playing well at the 4 too. And, it's weird to have so many questions about the starting lineup and how to like form it and shape it, which shouldn't be too surprising with the fact that, that CB's a new starter. There's always a chance that we were going to maybe move him out of the starting lineup, even though I think he's been really good. Just about how do you maximize the Nuggets' best like punch in a way and
Yeah.
get it more consistently? And if the answer is start Russell Westbrook, then that's the answer. But if it's not, then you look at other options. But I think, you're gonna have to be careful. I think, man. I mean, I will say I feel more confident about Russ playing in a playoff situation after watching like him recently than I was at the very beginning of the season where we thought he wouldn't maybe even play. But I think him
Yeah.
being on ball is much better for him if we have to go to that. It's just a matter of, thankfully in a playoff situation, more starters will be playing with him. So I feel like he could be okay. And he holds up defensively more, which is good. But if teams are like super exploiting it, we better like adjust to that quickly.
That's the thing for me is like closing wise, I don't know that there's a ton of difference between him and Christian closing because teams aren't like they're not guarding
They're not
Christian
guarding
either.
Christian either.
The difference I will say that's a little bit more consistent with Christian is that his off-ball cutting is more and his timing on that is more consistent. But Russ is getting better at that too
Yeah, he
now. I
is.
just
Yeah.
wonder the thing is like Russ has to be like he has to give the entry to Jokić and they're kind of running it's a two-man game, but Russ is off the ball now that he's given it to Jokić. Whereas Christian is fine like spacing from whatever and cutting from wherever. I don't know how great like Russ's timing on that always is when he's being ignored from like 2 passes away as opposed to the 1, right? Um, Christian is a more reliable above the break 3-point shooter. Do you know what Russ is shooting in corner threes this season? Well,
Is it like,
so I told you he's shooting about 32%.
is it 37%?
It's 46%.
Oh man. Yeah,
And he's like 50% in one corner and like 42% in the other quarter.
was it against the
Corner.
Mavs where he hit 2 corner threes?
He hit
Or
a
was it
couple
the
more
Nets?
against the Mavs too,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy
It's
to
like
think about.
if we could just give CB either obviously Russ's ball handling, that would be amazing. Like we would just be cooking if that were the case. If we could give CB Russ's corner 3-point shooting, can you imagine? Like if you asked
Oh,
me 6 months ago, who's shooting I want to give to Christian Brown,
it would
and
not
I
be
said
Russ.
Russell Westbrook actually, his corner 3-point shooting. That would have been awesome. But
Yeah.
like 46% for three. It's not on high volume, right? He's not taking a lot of them, but he's making the ones that he gets. Um, that's the other
Yeah.
thing I'm thinking. Like after I looked at those numbers, I was thinking, man, if Jokić could have just delivered that pass to Russ in the corner, he might have made that shot in that Spurs game.
Yeah, it's true.
Um, but Christian has also made a couple of big shots in the clutch and whatever. It's just like with all of these guys, Peyton too. Sometimes they make them and sometimes they don't. And it's not even the case. Casey didn't always make his corner threes. It just felt like he did. He didn't have like, especially like the ones in the clutch, but it felt like it was always going in,
Yeah.
right? Like you just trusted that more. So I think a lot of the conversation around this stuff is very like vibes based, and it's not really like there was in the Wizards game, like Julian had multiple opportunities at threes and he just didn't make them. Even though he was like a plus 18 in that game, like or plus 8, I forget. And he scored a lot in that game like throughout. But in the clutch, like he wasn't able to make those shots. And it's not I don't even think that that's a like Julian has also made other shots in the clutch in other games that he's gotten the opportunity to close earlier in the season. It's just one of those things where you're like this conversation is born out of none of these guys are KCP. I don't trust them. so we should like cycle through them and whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that I think Malone has taken the right approach to this, like in terms of just the starters, by keeping the starting lineup the same, at least for now, because you want that stability and you want guys' general roles to be clear cut so that they know like what they're going to be doing every night. And I think that I do think that that's more important because it's Russell Westbrook. And it's not just for him, but for the other guys in the roster. Like you don't want to confuse those roles unnecessarily. Last or in the title year, Bruce started whenever any starter was out. So he played a ton. He started a ton next to like on this team. And played a bunch next to Jokić and all of that. But when push came to shove in the playoffs, he was coming off the bench, and that was just known that that was what it was going to be. I had a question for you actually in the title year because I wasn't watching that team from the beginning of that season. I know KCP was making more money, but it wasn't that much more than Bruce. Like it was double, but it was like 5 or 6 million more.
Mm-hmm.
Was it clear from training camp that KCP would be the starting shooting guard?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was all.
So
I don't think
that was clear from the beginning.
I don't think it was ever questioned that like
Okay.
Bruce would ever be a starter over KCP and such. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I know some people have talked about, especially friend of the show, Matt Moore, has talked about the seeming investment that the team has in Christian more long term. I don't think that they're gonna not risk that, but like they want him to become a starter, so they need to play him like a starter and like hope that he
Yeah.
becomes a starting, like a
That
more closer to a starting caliber player.
that's my bigger point is
Yeah.
maybe if we were more desperate and the seeding was lower and like our record was worse and it was just like, damn, we need something because this is like starting.
Yeah.
We're panicking. Change the starting
Right.
lineup. Right now, we're like sitting pretty. Russ filled in for a starter. We won games, and it's like that's what like part of why we got Russ. It's like fill in, help, be a depth piece, come in, start if you need to, help us win, and that's what he did. So you should probably say thank you, send him back to the bench. Try to use what you've learned from him starting in other ways, like when you're rotating him in off the bench. And if you want to close with him in certain spots, then go ahead if he's playing well. I am leaning more towards CB or Pwat starting just because the Nuggets are going to be so much better off if one of them like seriously starts taking off.
I
Like
agree
you
with
got to
that.
play for that upside, and it's like it might be painful and it sucks to watch young players like struggling and making mistakes.
Yeah.
And maybe you're more forgiving of
It's
Russ
very painful watching Russ
mistakes.
make mistakes too, though,
Yeah.
I will say.
He just
So
makes
it's
up
like,
for it more quickly
Yeah.
than other guys. And I think, Russ is an, assisting maestro. So, he brings value so easily that way with the right
That's
players.
true. Like he makes Jokic's job a lot easier,
Yeah. So that is
which
like
I think has a lot of value.
yeah, that is a big argument for starting him. And I do want to play him more with Jokić rather than being like the bench.
And obviously the
guy.
easiest way to do that is by starting him. But it's like you also want to play these other guys with Jokić. Like we've been talking about this all season, how important it is that these young players get a lot of reps with Jokić so that we have like lineup versatility, and also like playing with Jokić helps their own development and things like that. And it's just like there are only 48 minutes in the game, and really like on a maximum 38 minutes to play of Jokić minutes times 4 other players on the floor for players to play next to Jokić, and there's just not enough of him to go around.
Yeah.
Right. That's the real problem. Like if Jokić could just play 48 minutes, then none of these are even questions.
I also think it's just so drastic to put Russ in the starting unit because, I mean, you could technically say, yeah, Russ is the starting shooting guard, but it's like he's a point guard and Jamal's going to have to play more off ball. So then it's like for the first time in, since we've had Jamal Murray coming into the starting point guard spot, we're shifting into the starting two. And it's like, that's such like a drastic shift, even though I get it's not really a huge deal basketball wise, but it just feels too extreme.
It's just unnecessary, I think, too, because he'll get a lot of that off ball time and time next to Russ in like staggered lineups. Like I think the politics of like who's starting is just too heavy for the question of like how do we get Russ more minutes with Jokić is ultimately what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And then
yeah,
what does it do to the bench unit? Because then it's like, okay, who's your starting two guard? And then it's like, then CB's coming in first off the bench for in the two spot, and then now Julian's not playing, which maybe you want because Julian's not playing so well. But then it's like, it has all ripple effects, and it's just like, how do
yeah.
you want to handle it? And probably we're best just keeping one of these guys in the starting unit. But I am leaning more towards trying Peyton as a starter. So let's talk about Pwat to like close the
So
show out.
yeah, actually related to what we were just talking about with the shooting and like who we trust in the clutch. Who do you think are the two highest 3-point percentage shooters in the clutch on this team?
Well, I mean, now I feel like it has to be Pwat because you're asking me.
I said two, so he's definitely one of them. He's shooting
Pwat and
60% from three in the clutch.
Pwat and Jokic.
What is Jokic shooting? Does he even? Jokic is shooting 50%. He's actually third.
Okay, is it Mike then?
It's Christian.
Oh, geez.
Christian is shooting 57% on his clutch threes this season. It's not like it's a ton, right?
Yeah.
These guys usually aren't getting a ton of 3-point shots in the clutch because we're trying to create twos almost as much as possible. Christian has 7 attempts. Pwat has 5. So very, very low sample sizes here. But yeah, Peyton's made his clutch threes at a pretty high clip this season. He is also another player that's in the running for these some of these closing minutes, and really in place of whoever, in place of Mike, in place of Christian, and in place of AG in this case because AG is injured. But we've had other games where Peyton has closed in place of those guys when they weren't injured, and it was just like a better matchup for them. I've been incredibly impressed with Peyton Watson really this whole season, particularly defensively. He had a stretch, I think, in like mid to late December where things kind of tailed off on that end. He was really getting bullied on the ball by like smaller players that were just kind of burying him under the rim and then getting a layup out of it. So that was really annoying, him playing on ball. But he has, I think, recovered a bit from that. Also, there haven't been that many players that have, employed the same tactics in the last couple of weeks. But Peyton has taken on a variety of roles throughout this whole season, but particularly over this most recent stretch of the last 2 weeks or so. In the game versus the Hawks, he had this great block when he was guarding Trey on the ball in pick and roll. Trey gets in front of him, obviously, because Trey is very small, very quick, and Peyton has to trail him, but does so very effectively and utilizes his 7'1" wingspan to block the ball from behind, and the Nuggets, it turns into a run out for the Nuggets, and they are able to score on the other end. So that's on the ball stuff. In this most recent Mavs game, we saw a big difference between when MPJ is the low man versus when AG or even Peyton is the low man. There was this play in the Mavs game where I forget who's running the pick and roll, but Peyton kind of rotates over to tag, I think it's Maxi Kleber on the roll. I don't even think he had to, and I was kind of like, "Why are you pinching in so much there?" Because I'm pretty sure Jokić is like there in time to recover, and he leaves. I think it's Najee Marshall in the corner, and Peyton is able to recover all the way back to the 3-point line and block his shot. And I definitely thought that was up and in because Najee Marshall just likes to cook us. But it's just like he's able to make all these great athletic plays, and we've talked a lot about especially in his on-ball role, how he is like a better screen navigator than Christian, just because he has more like margin for error basically on his recovery around screens. And it's true in low man possessions as well, right? And he and Christian are both very athletic, but obviously Peyton has the length to, contest shots at the rim. He has, I think, better timing for sure than MPJ in low man situations, just making sure he tags that big in time. But I think just like his presence on the floor generally makes a really big difference in the Nuggets defensively. Like, he's basically involved in all of my favorite defensive games of the season, which have been especially like ones that were like were close and came down to like final possessions, like versus the Thunder early in the year for sure. Obviously, this Mavs game was big. The game versus the Spurs in overtime. I actually thought in that if I had a criticism of Malone in that first game, like Payton played really well in that first game, particularly defensively. And it wasn't just on Wemby. And I thought he should have played more in that game. And I think Malone agreed, which is why he played him so much in that second game. He has started to really show more consistent signs of being like a defensive presence in a variety of ways on the floor for us. Has anything stood out to you in that
Just,
regard?
yeah, the defense. I mean, to be like very transparent, I've been, in and out on pretty much all the Booth boys, like over this
Yeah.
little stretch. Like, I've been like high on Julian and like wanting to play him more. And then now I'm like pretty low on him. And I've been out on Pwat and been like, I don't know that he's the right fit for this team. Like, yeah, he has a super high ceiling and potential, but like we're just like not getting it and we don't have the time to wait for it and all that. And then when I saw him playing against Wemby in that second Spurs game, I was like, oh dang, like he's untouchable. We can't get rid of this guy, like, because that's just like so valuable. I know we have AG and stuff like that, but just to have super long guys who can be employed differently against very threatening offensive players. My eyes was almost open to Pwat in that moment. And if you're a listener and you're always high on Pwat, like congratulations. Like I'm more skeptical of like players who aren't showing offensive upside because I care more about that. But we do need versatile defense around Jokić, and he's the staple of the Nuggets. So I'm more leaning towards never trading Pwat. Please keep him with the Nuggets. Could he be a starting two? I'm starting to be on that train. I don't want to take Mike or AG out of the starting lineup, so it's just like by necessity would have to do that. I get that he's not the typical two, but I've been more like on that side of him being more towards the 3 or the 2 than the 4, even though he did play good at the 4 for AG when he was out. So you can do that in spurts. It's a question of how he's going to develop and where
Right.
he's gonna end up like kind of being and solidifying himself. So who knows? I mean, I know his shooting's a little rough, but we were going to talk about this, but I don't think we did. The flash he had to the free throw line when Julian couldn't enter the ball to Jokić, and then he flashed, and then he did the pass to Jokić and got in that ball. Just cool little smart moves like that is good to see. And he hit 2 threes in that Mavs game. And if CB's 3 is down, how long are you going to wait until you're just like, let's just play Payton? Because we like Payton taking off is like changing the narrative of this team by a lot. And so
I completely
it's a
agree with
hard
that for
question. Yeah.
sure. If there was somebody I was gonna like that I would take like Christian out of the starting lineup for, it would be Peyton for that reason. Because I'm just curious about like what his developmental trajectory could look like. We should talk a little bit more about some of his offensive flashes in this stretch as well. So versus the Nets, he actually had a really nice drive and finish through contact. He's been finishing through contact at the rim a lot better lately. It's not that he looks like he's gotten stronger or anything. He just happens to be making these layups through contact more. Maybe it's a focus thing. I don't know what. He's also shooting pretty well at the free throw line, almost 80%. And he's getting more sort of and one opportunities and free throw opportunities as well. In that Nets game, he also had a nice kind of drive, and then like it was like a dump off or maybe a pocket pass to DJ in the lane. This was an off ball, so I think Jamal reverses the ball to him. Peyton gets to attack with an advantage, draws the help, and then DJ is rolling and gets that pocket pass from him and is able to finish. We saw a lot more playmaking from him in that game. He had 5 assists in the first half. I think he finished with 5 assists. So I wanted to see a little bit more in the second half, and I thought he might get more reps actually because Jamal went out. And it seemed like they've been wanting to use him more on the ball, but not so much in the second half in terms of the playmaking. But he definitely flashed some things there. You talked about him flashing middle. I have in my notes here another flash of him being a zone buster because we talked about him being able to break zones that way. Another lineups where Malone's kind of gone to him at the 5 in some iterations, and in order to break certain zones, and he does have good feel on the floor and just like reading space in that way. And I wish we could see more of that consistently when he plays with Jokić, like to the point where I'm like, if he had Christian's cut timing, I don't think
Hmm.
it'd be a question
Yeah.
at this point about him starting. But there are some times where he and Mike in particular, you're kind of not always able to trust that they're going to be in the right place on the floor at the same time. Whereas Christian is almost never in the wrong place. So he can't hurt the offense in that
Yeah.
way.
His floor is so
Um,
much higher sometimes than Pwat.
exactly,
So it's just,
exactly. But if Peyton had that cut instinct in terms of just the timing, it's not that he doesn't cut. It's just like the
yeah.
timing. And but that also comes with just like time and reps and development, right? Like Christian he was a 3-year student at Kansas, is that right? And Peyton was there for 1 year
And like never played.
and never played. So he didn't really get to develop some of that stuff. Oh, on the zone busting thing, I just wanted to say that AG did a lot of that versus the Mavs. Not necessarily buzzing his own, but hitting like a little turnaround jumper from the free throw line. It's just funny that like in a year where our mid-range game as a team is much lower in frequency than last year, where we were one of the top mid-range frequency teams last season. Two of the players that are taking the most biddies are not necessarily players that you would expect to be taking middies on this team. But yeah, defensively, I just feel like the ceiling is so high, and even his defensive floor is not as low as I would have thought. He definitely still has lapses. Christian doesn't have lapses, but his floor, I think Peyton's floor is higher than we think, just because he has so much margin for error with his tools, and he's not making quite as many mistakes as I would have, as many as I would have. And he's just, I think, gotten better as the year has gone on. Yeah. So, I mean, on that, I just want to share some of the defensive facts about the team at this point, because it is related to how, this conversation about Peyton and like, how can we be better? And Peyton has been closing some more games of late, right? This team, you mentioned it earlier, they're 30th in first quarter defense. They're allowing a 119.9, so basically a 120 defensive rating in the first quarters, which is would be like the worst defense in NBA history.
So slow to start.
In first quarters. It's crazy. We're actually 5th in fourth quarter defense, with basically a 107 defensive rating, on the season. And I looked into the quarters because I didn't realize that the splits were so dramatic between first and the rest of the game. But I knew that the splits between first half and second half were pretty dramatic. Fourth quarter defense, like I said, is really good. And a lot of it is 3-point noise, because opponents are shooting about 4% worse from three versus Denver in second halves. One of the things I found interesting when I was looking into are we changing opponent shot profiles in the second halves of games? We're actually allowing more 3-point shots in second halves than first half. So it's not necessarily threes. I think we're just protecting the interior a little bit better. And even versus the Mavs, you could see like all of the threes they got in that first half were wide open, that Clay got in that first half were wide open. And yeah, they made a lot fewer threes in the second half, even though they took more, but it felt like none of them were open. Like all of them were contested in that second half. And I wouldn't have been surprised if they made some more of them, because they still got those shots, but they were not wide open like they were in the first half. I just think we're just flying around more in the second halves. And I've talked about this before. There's a difference between like fourth quarter defense and clutch defense, which is still not where I would like it to be on the whole. And face versus this Mavs team, it was another example of us playing a team that doesn't have, more than one, or even in this case, even one on ball like shot creator. I mean, we had Spencer Dinwiddie, but like that was not like, I'm not going to be impressed because they defended Spencer Dinwiddie. I'm going to be happy that they like locked down for sure, because you still have to actually like guard a team. But I'd like to see some of that versus a team that has more offensive firepower, because we were able to do that last season. We were able to shut down teams that had high level offensive players in the clutch. I will say though, in the second halves, we jumped from 23rd to 13th in opponent turnover rate. So I do think that we're playing with more pressure and forcing more opponent turnovers in second halves. And in the fourth quarters, we're actually sixth. So that's another interesting thing. And it just kind of goes along with my my narrative about what kind of defense we should be playing. Like we should be like going at the ball
But
because we
yeah,
have the personnel for it.
and you saw that a lot in Jokić recently, even in the Nets game too, where he's like
Yeah.
swiping at the ball and getting, on screens and little pocket passes, swiping it away. Just because that's where a lot of the times our defense starts is Jokić in that action. And if you miss, go for the steal and miss, you're depending on, backline rotations, which I feel like a lot of teams know how to exploit now on the Nuggets because it's just like a standard kind of practice.
I just think that, again, because of who our personnel is, it's more impactful defensively for us to play up with a lot of pressure and just fly around as much as possible and go after the ball than try to force like misses on shots that these players can hit because our personnel is just not as like good defensively, like staying in front of
Yeah,
people and
just
all of
holding
that
up
stuff.
for a
Like
long time.
we need to be more ball hawkish. And I do think that Russ has helped a lot with that for sure. And really the only player who I think is well, two players that are not really like well equipped for that are both CB and MPJ. CB because I don't think he has like the wingspan for it, and he tries to play more like fundamentally sound. When he's playing off ball, he can be a lot more vigilant and all that, but he plays on ball so much, so we don't really get that, right?
Yeah.
MPJ is just like I'm like, man, go after the ball. He does sometimes like poke at things sometimes, but it's just not really in him to
Yeah.
he doesn't like to get out of position because he knows he can get blown by pretty easily.
Yeah.
So I kind of understand it from him. But Jokić has such great hands. Jamal has really great hands when he's engaged both on and off the ball. Peyton absolutely can. We know AG can be that force, particularly at like he can get more like blocks at the rim and things like that. He's like a player where I don't care because I think he's gonna be good whether
Yeah,
he's doing
exactly.
that or not
He
because
can do
he
what
is
he
very
wants.
yeah, he can do what he wants. But all these other guys, I'm like, I need y'all to be scrappy. Like
Yeah, it's a
I
good
need you
point.
to be
And
uh
it can be frustrating if, you're gambling and you miss it and then it's an open dunk or something. It's going to happen, but yeah, I think the advantage of like trying to be like that's probably worth it.
completely agree. So I just wanted to share that because I thought the opponent turnover rate thing was like I was just trying to figure out like what's going on in these second halves that I can actually point to. Because yes, there is the opponents are shooting a bit worse from three in those second halves, but it doesn't explain the entire difference. And eye test is telling me that they're doing something more in those second halves. It's just hard to point to what it is, and I really just think it's that
Yeah, right.
um, just applying more pressure.
Yeah, and
So
makes sense. They always try harder. I mean, the game's coming down to the wire. You're going to have to try to win it, and that's what we do. So,
yeah, but
but
again, I'd like to see some better stuff in the clutch in some of these games because even as good as the Mavs game was, and again they were without both Luka and Kyrie. There were other clutch games even in this stretch where I'm like, oh my gosh, we need to stop giving up layups in the clutch. Like that was happening in the Spurs game.
yeah,
Uh, Not so much in the Celtics game. That was just like we were just getting beat in the Celtics game. But yeah, I think that seeing more of that consistently in winning time would be very nice.
hopefully. We'll see
Um,
when we ever put this together and like sacrifice. Maybe we don't need to be fifth in the fourth quarter defense because we're not in a tight game. If you more in the middle,
exactly.
like eighth in defense across the whole game, that might be a
Yeah,
lot
that would be
easier,
really
but
nice.
we'll see if that ever happens.
Let's move on to our preview of the next few games. So the Nuggets are playing the Mavs again tomorrow, probably a few hours after this episode releases. I have pretty low expectations for that game. If I'm being honest, because I was mostly expecting a split between these two Mavs games. Now, look, they're without Luca and Kyrie. We can beat them, but I just don't think we will. I think they're going to come back and they're going to be like, man, like we need to not lose both of these games in the standings to them. It is like it has tiebreaker implications as well. If we win that game, we have the tiebreaker. If they win the game, then it's just a series split because it's 2-2, which could be important for seeding at the end of the season. So I think that they're going to come back with probably some pretty aggressive game planning and all of that. But we could also beat them, and I wouldn't be surprised either way. What do you think?
I feel like we're going to keep the momentum that we got from kind of like figuring out maybe what works a little more from the second half. I think it'll be hard for the Mavs to compete again, but I still think it'll be close at times because of Nuggets lapses. But if Luka and Kyrie don't play, I still think we win.
Okay. Then we have the game versus the Houston Rockets. I'm just checking the schedule right now. That game is at home, so it's in Ball.
That's a
which
loss.
I don't feel great about because they're not winning. They're not winning games at home. That's an L. I feel like it too. I feel like this Houston Rockets team is really good, really scrappy. Like they're not going to come out lackadaisical in that first quarter, and we definitely will because we just always do.
I don't think we're going to be ready for the punch of the Rockets. They were killing us last year, and they're better this year. And I don't know.
We went 3-1 with the Rockets last year, including a loss at home. They're super athletic. Right now they have Amon Thompson. They had Amon last year, but he wasn't playing as much in the rotation.
Yeah, he's
is Tari Eason out? Because I didn't see him play in the recent game that they had against the Grizzlies.
I have no idea.
He might be injured or something. I think Şengün has regressed a little bit from last season offensively.
Yeah.
But they're just a really good all-around defensive team. Like they're going to be hounding Jamal. I don't know that their rim protection is as good. So maybe Russ will feast more inside. I'm not sure. I'm also curious, like when is AG going to start back in the starting lineup? So that's going to change some things too, with like spacing and all of that. If he does start, I feel I'm smelling an L. I'm just going to like leave that there. But if we do win it, we're closer to catching the Rockets in the standings for second place. So if we win it, I'll be very happy. But if we lose it, I'll just be like, kind of expected.
That's a big game, like just to kind of see how we stack up. I mean, everyone's theoretically healthy right now, knock on wood that continues, and Jamal continues to feel better, because I want to see if we can be competitive and like maybe win that game.
The next game after that's beginning of it's a very mini East Coast road trip. So they're going to play the Miami Heat. And that is Jimmy Butler's first game back from his suspension. I'm curious about what kind of Jimmy we get. It feels like the Miami Heat play us better when Jimmy is off the floor than on, because they just move the ball more. And I feel like we guard Jimmy pretty well. Yeah, so that should be a W. We just generally don't lose to the Heat. I won't be surprised if we lose, but I'll be disappointed if we lose and like it's because Jimmy got benched in the second half or something.
Yeah, I think we should win, but it's on the road.
Then we have the Orlando Magic in Orlando. I'm going to that game. I'm very excited to go to that game. I saw them versus the Magic last year, and that was tough because they were like winning Jokic's minutes, and the bench was getting killed, particularly on the glass. This is when Zeke was the backup five. In the clutch, they were without Jamal in that game. And the clutch was really kind of ugly on both ends because offensively, like Reggie missed a layup off like they were hedging a lot on Jokić. So he was just like, oh, I'll just play point and then create open layups for these other guys. Reggie missed an open layup, and they weren't able to get stops on the other end because it was just Franz ISOing MPJ over and over again.
Yeah.
Which was tough. They should win that, but I won't be surprised if they lose because the Magic team they're big. Still, even with, I don't know what kind of injury Goga Batadze got last game, but they still have Wendell Carter Jr., they still have Jonathan Isaac. They're missing Mo Wagner, which is big for them, but they're just really scrappy, and they're not gonna let up in first quarters either. And we could, be playing from a really tough deficit early. But they're a really good defensive team.
Kind of a toss up because they have intensity that could really get us off our rhythm, but they are injured, so I expect to win, but I wouldn't be surprised if we lost for sure.
We just never win in Orlando for some reason. Maybe this is AG's chance.
Has he never won one in Orlando as a Nugget?
I don't know about never, but not since I've been watching the team.
I feel like sometimes he plays well in Orlando, but we never win.
He played well in that game too, the one I went to in person. Then they play the Sixers in Denver. I'm curious if certain players play in that game.
Will we finally see it in the year when the Sixers are irrelevant and
Yeah,
Not in MVP contention for Embiid,
that's true.
not
He might just be
competing.
like, no, I'm not traveling for that. He's been missing a lot of road games lately. He doesn't just skip out on road trips entirely, but he definitely skips some. And I haven't checked to see if that's like a back to back or anything for them.
I feel like
Like if
he's
I
going to
look at
play
the
just because
Sixers
it's been
schedule.
way too long where he hasn't. And I feel like he's just going to be like, I'm going to play. But it's just funny that
But he has no reason to, because
yeah.
like he's got his own like little nicks and bruises that he's dealing with. Also, their team sucks. The season's basically over for them, but they haven't like said it yet.
Why don't they just shut Embiid down for a season?
Not great, Stan. That could be an L because we just
Oh, God.
I don't know
Hopefully not.
actually, because it's crazy. The non-Embiid minutes have been worse this year than like ever. So maybe our bench actually does something in that game. I That's like a toss up. We just don't take Eastern Conference teams generally very seriously, but we need to take care of business in these games. So I think if they're serious about making a run for the second seed, they should win that game. Otherwise, I'll
You
be
have to
pretty
win that.
disappointed.
If Embiid
Unless like if
plays,
Embiid plays and he like
yeah,
plays really well, like I
then
won't be
yeah.
surprised if they lose it.
But if he
But
doesn't, you have to win.
yeah. All right. Well, that's the skinny on the Denver Nuggets for this most recent stretch. I hope they win more games. I'm starting to think that like they're gonna fall comfortably into like the 3 seed. That's like what I'm feeling right now for this
That
season.
would be a dream. That's like all I wanted coming into this season. And I
I
was not
know.
thinking we were going to get there. But if we
It's a
do, it would
very
be
circular
amazing.
way of getting there because we kind of started off the season like
Bad.
maybe
And
they'll be fighting for second. Then we were like eighth and trying to scrap our way out of that morass. And now there's an opportunity here to really create some separation because these are all like we could go 5-0 on in
yeah.
the next 5 games, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was like 2-3.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, these Mavs games and Nets games that we talked about, the last two wins are, we won the games, but it was against severely limited teams. So it's hard to know exactly how we're doing. I mean, I like the fact that we won them, but there's definitely concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it considering the start.
Yeah, exactly. But we never did get to talk about Jimmy Butler, who, he had some scathing comments about the Heat and how this situation might be untenable and not fixable, and he wants to be traded. And the Heat ended up suspending him for 7 games. And Pat Riley is a very intense individual. So, and Jimmy Butler is like, it's like the unmovable force meets the,
Yeah, meets
you know,
or Jimmy's the unstoppable force and
yeah.
Riley's the immovable object.
But he is due back for the Nuggets game that's coming up soon. So that's,
Yeah. I'm very curious to see if the Jimmy that the Nuggets get is saboteur Jimmy, who is pissed off that Pat Riley won't trade him slash find a trade with him. I will say there were reports coming out that multiple teams had been told not to trade for Jimmy Butler, like probably by his agent. And it just kind of reminded me of the Dame situation a couple summers ago, where the same thing was happening. And his agent was making public comments about like where Dame wanted to be and like all of that stuff. And they ended up getting fined by the league. So I was like, didn't we literally just go through this? Like, that's not allowed. It also makes it more difficult for, like, it doesn't really help Jimmy to do that because it makes it more difficult for the Heat to find a trading partner for him. Obviously, he's doing it because he's trying to get one particular destination in the Suns, but the Heat do not want Bradley Beal's contract. And the Suns would likely have to give up uh, first round draft capital to move that contract to a third team, for example. But it's just like a whole mess. And really, like, this is like the Dame saga. It's just another sort of tick in the column for the difference that we're seeing now in the level of power that players have over like where they go and like trade packages and all of that stuff now with the new CBA. And it's not like there are any like explicit restrictions on things that players and agents, could do before, besides literally like the public comments, like I just talked about. It's just that teams are so much more strapped now that all the things they used to do sort of extra just to like keep players happy, like let me extend this guy a year early to keep him happy, and like give him a player option to keep him happy, trade him where he wants to be to keep him happy. The calculus is different now because the penalties for a bad contract on your books or an unproductive player, all that stuff is just worse now than it was before. It's more onerous. So you're weighing like keeping certain players happy a lot less against these other consequences. It's definitely an interesting sort of economy in the NBA in that sense.
Yeah, I wonder how much the owners were like cognizant of what the effect would be of the CBA to kind of undercut some of the players' power to like demand where they want to go in these situations, because it was a lot easier early, before all this.
And this kind
But
of goes along with one of the thoughts that I've had about the new CBA and like which classes of players are most affected. I don't actually think the like middle group of players is that negatively impacted because of like we've talked about this in the past on the show. Like there are definitely like middle to higher level role players that just have a bigger market because those guys just are more valuable when there is like more parity. Any like margin that you can get matters more. So you see guys like KCP getting paid, Bruce Brown getting paid, and maybe that's just my bias because I'm viewing this through the lens of a Nuggets fan and like us not being able to afford these guys anymore. But the groups of players that are affected are definitely like older vets, in particular on the like vet minimum end of the scale, because you have all these like younger rookie contract guys that teams are trying to like basically replace the older vets with. Um, who were made cheaper by this new CBA because of some of the rules around like you can give longer term contracts to like second round guys and like things like that. But also guys at the upper end who just don't have quite as much flexibility and quite as much of a market because their contracts are so big. And so if you're not a franchise guy, basically like a 1A, the guys who never move anyway because Shea's not going anywhere, Jokić isn't going anywhere, Luka's not going anywhere, Giannis for now isn't going anywhere. But if you're like those like 1Bs and like number 2 guys that they know can't be the best player on a team, um, it doesn't always mean that you won't get paid. Because in the case of we talked about Jamal Murray all summer, he had to wait all summer to get extended in a situation where in the past that would have been just a no-brainer extension at some point earlier in the summer in a previous iteration of the CBA. Brandon Ingram hasn't been extended by the New Orleans Pelicans, and they've been trying to move him forever because they don't want to extend him to a max contract. Paul George, he gets paid, but he doesn't get to stay on the team that he wants to be on in the location that he wants to be at in the LA Clippers because they don't want to pay him. So he ends up having to go to Philadelphia to get that money. And now we've seen in not sequential summers, but we saw with Dame 2 summers ago wanting to move. He doesn't get to go to the place that he wants to be because of the not just because of the size of his contract, because Portland is trying to get the best deal for him. Whether or not they actually got it, I think it's actually pretty debatable. Uh, Based on like what they got from like the Drew swap ultimately versus what maybe Miami was offering. Uh, but they didn't want to be bullied by the Miami Heat and like sent Dame wherever, and Dame frankly because his representation was sort of in some kind of indirect collusion to try to get Dame there, and that didn't work. And now the Heat don't want to be bullied by Jimmy Butler and send him somewhere that's going to result in them taking on a bad contract onto their books. So it's it's a really interesting shift in the power dynamic, not just with the players, but like agents have less power too, right? Um, and I think that is also interesting because certain agents and agencies have had a lot of power and a lot of influence and kind of they've built teams before. Like you could say the New York Knicks were built by CAA, like the current iteration of the New York Knicks, especially after Karl Anthony Towns goes there and Julius Randle, I believe, left CAA was the middle of last season to his new agency. I forget which one he's with right now. So that's interesting, which is why news like I don't even know if we talked about it on the show, but both Zion and Brandon Ingram left their respective agencies within like a week of each other. Not to go to a new one, but it was just like, oh, that's interesting. Is it like, especially for guys that are not Zion, but like Brandon's up for extension, and you'd think like, did you leave your agency? Did your agency fire you, especially like when you're in a contract year, like that's big money that could come their way too. There's a lot of like weird money dynamics that are involved in the background of all of this stuff. And I think that that's another layer of what was perhaps um, inspiring the restrictions of the CBA. 'Cause, you know, these billionaire owners never like getting pushed around by anybody because they're egomaniacs, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to end up, but yeah, it's just harder when there's less teams that have even a realistic path to adding players like this. And it's just like
yeah,
so many less options. And I think in recent years, people have talked about how like teams draft capital to be able to use in trades is just drying up. Like so many of it's been just like sent other places. And so you don't even have that to incentivize
yeah.
teams to take on
Because
contracts. And you
draft
have,
capital's concentrated in, like, 4 teams.
yeah,
It's like
yeah, exactly.
well, New York before the Mikal Bridges trade, now I feel like the Nets are starting to amass, like, a tiny little cache of picks. Obviously, OKC, like, they have the biggest stash, and the Jazz,
The
I think the
Rockets have a ton of
Rockets
the Suns.
and the Spurs.
Hmm.
Like,
And
yeah,
OKC still, of
yeah,
course.
for
So,
sure.
uh, yeah, it's part, and it reminds me. We don't have to go into this now. We can talk about it later on, but like, it does remind me a bit of. Obviously, I'm focused on the Nuggets reality, and like they have all these big contracts, and who knows what'll happen this trade deadline or even in the summer. But it's just so much harder with bigger contracts, and got to be very careful about what those big contracts are. I wonder if in a couple of years we'll start to see more tiered like contracts of some kind where it's like truly those 1As that you're talking about have massive ones. Obviously, it's going to take many years because a lot of these players have like super long contracts. So, and I don't know when we'll start seeing teams being like, well, you're not really at that level, so we're going to get you down a little bit more with what we're offering you. But I feel like teams are going to have to do that because of how restricted this salary is and stuff like that. So who knows how that'll
Yeah.
shape out. But
And the thing is, like, outs not just supermax, but other like just the designated, not designated veteran, but just veteran maxes are a creation of the CBA. Like those are written into the CBA, what that percentage is. So like that slightly lower than like the upper echelon tier is like written into the CBA, but maybe there needs to be like another
I
one
know.
that could be like,
Yeah.
we recognize that you're like a really good player, but you're not quite like a 1A or even like a reliable number two. Um, and there are like lots of guys in the league that would probably be recognized as being sort of that level. But when you start doing that, you also put a little bit more power in the players' hands because you make it so that more teams can afford them. Part of why even supermax contracts exist, and you'll recall they didn't exist when Kevin Durant went to Golden State, because if they did, OKC would have been able to pay Kevin Durant a supermax and nobody else would have been able to. So that's like another thing. Like that was partially created to keep franchise stars with their team, with their like sometimes smaller market teams. So there's a push and pull there. With so it's not just about like, oh, if teams could pay players less, like they'll just automatically have more power. Not necessarily, because that means that lots more teams can afford that player like at that price point, so the player can be like, oh well, I mean, I like this location better, or like this like playing situation a little bit better, things like that. um like if I'm not going to be getting like that top tier money, then there are other considerations that come into play, and that's always the like you think about it on the micro scale with the Nuggets, because we have all these players that or not all of them, but like a bunch of players that have player options. So you're just like, why does this guy have a player option? and it's like, I guess nobody wants to come to Denver. But then I look at smaller market teams like the Pacers or even the Timberwolves, and I'm like, these guys don't all have a bunch of player options. So like, what are we doing here? There's no way that like Denver nightlife is that much worse than Minneapolis like nightlife.
Yeah. Especially playing
But
with Jokić. I mean, come on. He's got to be
I
a
know.
attractive destination. But we'll get more into the trade deadline as it gets closer. I am someone who wants to see fun, explosive trades. Like, I just think it's fun, but we're seeing less of that. And all the speculation around trades to, I don't know what word you want to use, devolves or evolves into this conversation about contracts, which I don't know how many people care about. That's an interesting topic in itself, is how much
Yeah,
fans
that's
care
true.
about this kind of stuff versus like, I just want to see this guy traded to my team. That's not as
I
fun as an
wonder
NBA
I
fan.
I wonder if it would be a like I feel like NFL fans care about this stuff. And I think they care about it more because the NFL has a hard cap and has, to my knowledge, always had been a hard cap situation. So these conversations have always been like crucial to team building. Whereas now we have kind of like a soft hard cap in the second apron in the NBA, and it's a newer development. And fans haven't always been able to sort of like, dream up all of these like free flowing trades for the most part, to kind of dream up. And now there's a bunch of stuff that just doesn't work. Whereas I feel like maybe in a few years, like that'll just be part of it once it becomes more like normal in
Yeah,
terms of
could
like the
be.
discourse with like, yeah, I feel like casual NFL fans talk about contract sizes and stuff like that all the time, and like why certain things work and certain things don't, at least from my like outside observation, because I'm not really like a big football fan. But it seems like that is like an ever present actually part of the conversation about roster building, especially, I mean, we don't have to get into this like too much, but yeah, I've been watching the NFL playoffs started this weekend, and it felt like a lot of the conversation about like some of the teams that like didn't make the playoffs or that did but got eliminated this weekend immediately goes to like, okay, what are the parts of your team that you want to prioritize? Like maybe you've got like a really good rookie quarterback and you're not paying him a ton of money, so you can put more money into your offensive line, or you can put money into your special teams or your defensive units and things like that. But you can't spend everywhere, and that's just the fact that you can't spend everywhere and make everything good is just like known, like it's just a baseline. So they talk about like what should we emphasize here, but that's not the case when it comes to NBA discourse necessarily, and I think part of that's because it's been so easy in the past. And I don't follow baseball at all, and I know you've got like baseball muted on your Twitter and things like that, but they like don't have salary caps.
Yeah, I
So
don't know
it's
anything
literally
about that.
just like four teams that everybody talks about that can afford to just do everything. And so that's like a completely different situation too. Um, yeah, I think it's interesting, and I wonder if people will find it interesting in the future. Other people. Yeah.
Well, hopefully some fun stuff happens and we'll see some new teams or exciting combinations of players, maybe even on the Nuggets. You never know. Okay, listeners, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for spending time with us. If you're new, please consider subscribing. If you're a lurker and you haven't subscribed yet, consider finally hitting the subscribe button and helping us out. Hit the like button and the notification button. We need all the support we can get. And if you do that for us, we would love it. If you're listening to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, leave a review for us so that we can also grow there. We need all the help we can get from you listeners. Follow us on our socials for when we put out shorts and other content, as well as our other clip channel. And just remember that winning is fun and losing sucks.